This is a highly professional, well-coordinated broadcasting event under the auspices, I was going to say Disney, that's probably a bad idea. But then I have my attorney here, so. Hi, everybody. Welcome home. I'm so grateful to Logan Crowell and his staff for having us here today, hosting this workshop. My name is Charles Alexander. I'm an independent singer-songwriter, but that career has pretty much ended. And so now I'm mostly on the business side. I have a labeled services company called Systemic, and one of our core skill sets is strategy and marketing on streaming services, especially around Spotify and Apple Music. I also manage a couple of artists out of a sister company called Outside the Box Music. And we also manage, curate, coordinate, and basically take care of a family of playlists on Spotify called Tastemaker. I am incredibly thrilled today to have my friend who knows way more about this than I do, and I'm excited that he's here to share his knowledge on different streaming platforms, but on Spotify in particular, because for a while there, he was behind the green wall. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend, John Butler from Getty Music.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles.
So as part of my gig, one of the things that happens a lot is that, you know, when an artist or a management team or a label, if they happen to be working with us, when they come to us, one of the first things they want, and really one of the last things they want, and honestly, the only thing they want in most cases is New Music Friday on Spotify. That's all they care about, or a massive playlist. And so for a long time, that was our business model, and you know, to work with the curators and with the artist label marketing teams to get music on playlists. And if that's your only goal, and if that's the end-all, be-all, you're kind of doing yourself a disservice. And so this workshop is really more about what you can do to empower yourself to be not so dependent, or as I like to say, be codependent on playlists. And that, you know, it matters very little if it's Spotify or Apple Music or Amazon or whatever. This is really more about how do you grow your presence on any of those platforms in such a way that you become a focus, that you become a destination on those platforms. I'm not going to lie to you, it's going to be hard. It's hard work. But then if you're a musician in this town, you already know about hard work. So this is just like one more thing. It's no biggie. All right. So we did the introduction. We have material that's part of this presentation that you can have to some extent that we'll be happy to send you. If you just text the word streaming to the number 31996, we'll have your contact info. You'll have to double opt in because them's the rules. And then we can get that stuff to you so you don't have to worry about catching what we're presenting up on screen. I promise you there are pieces of this workshop that are going to make your head spin. We're not trying to do that on purpose to confuse you. There's just a lot, and it's going to take repetition and seeing information over and over again to kind of get it. But we're going to try to make this process as smooth and as user-friendly as possible. All right? Okay, so why should we care about streaming in general? Well, there's a few different reasons, but the biggest one is that the music business is in what appears to be a recovery or renaissance since the dark days of illegal downloading and when revenue cratered and all that stuff, and revenue is coming back up. the business seems healthy, and depending on who you believe or what you read, or what you believe that you read, the business is going to be in the 30 to 40 billion dollar number in about around 2020, 2030. Around 2030. And so just from 2016 to 2017, the growth was 8%. I'm sure there's more up-to-date information coming. There should be one coming out probably end of June for the halfway mark. And we'll see what those numbers look like. But all indications are that things are looking healthy. And most of that revenue is coming from streaming. In some markets around the globe, some of that is still being driven by physical, but for the most part, streaming seems to be the biggest share of the pie. And so this is just a chart that shows you, where streaming has made an impact over the last few years. So obviously in 1999, there was no such thing. And now, it's about 6.6% of the market. And it's, again, or rather 6.6, I can't tell, it's $6.6 billion worth of the market. And it's just going to keep growing. So from an economic standpoint, whether you believe in streaming as a format for music consumption or not, the rest of the world does. So you just need to make an informed choice about how far you want to go down or how far you want to commit to it as a platform, because it's here. And it's going to keep growing, and it's going to be, for the foreseeable future, the major mode of consumption for most consumers. Again, this is just sort of a pie chart of physical digital streaming performance rights sync revenues, which are also pretty significant. So I don't think it's any accident that when you get a good sync, you show up on streaming platforms more significantly, and vice versa. And in fact, that's a big discussion in the sync community these days, is chicken or egg, right? So if you're pitching to sync, one of the things they want to find out, especially if you've had no previous sync history, is whether you have a strong presence on streaming platforms. So it's no accident that you're hearing Billie Eilish everywhere currently. It's no accident that you're hearing Maggie Rogers everywhere currently. It's all because, to some extent, those two things go hand in hand. And people who make decisions about those kinds of things look on both sides of that stuff. And of course, touring and your regular, artists and music career around touring, whether, ticket sales, all those things matter, right? So these are the top 10 streaming music markets in the world. This is from 2017. I believe Spain has displaced, I want to say maybe France, but do you have any idea?
I think Mexico is probably pretty significant now. Mexico, from a Spotify standpoint, was the #2 market in the world.
Yeah.
So
one of the markets, I'm trying to figure this out. One of the markets that was sort of a surprise to me was Brazil, but I saw one of your former compadres at South by this year, and like, yeah, Brazil. Brazil's like one of the most amazing streaming markets in the world. And so now when we do social advertising around streaming, or trying to, help with discovery of a new or emerging artist on streaming platforms, we target Brazil and Mexico pretty heavily, mostly because we already know that streaming as a consumption form is a huge thing in those countries, and our social media advertising tends to bear that out. So I believe these are the rough numbers currently. They could be significantly out of date, but it's sort of the ballpark thing. These are overall whole numbers. They're not paid subscription numbers. That's a little bit lower, or actually it might be significantly lower. I think Spotify is at about 40 million paid, and Apple is at about 28, 28, something like that. In fact, the paid number for Apple now, I think, is higher than the paid number for Spotify. And so I want to quickly talk about some success stories on the platform, specifically on Spotify especially. Maren Morris, who's here, a Nashville artist, who might be one of the first cross-genre artists from country to pop, at least on streaming platforms. And given where women are in country, on radio specifically, it's pretty significant that she's one of the biggest success stories on the platform. And that's kind of launched a career. And later on this presentation, I'd like for John to kind of talk about a little bit about how that happened, maybe, if you have an idea.
For Lauren Daigle or for Maren?
Oh, just a brief summary on Maren.
There's just like little stuff about Maren that I'll be able to talk to you about.
You want to talk about that now?
Well, yeah, it was actually even before I was at Spotify. I don't know if you guys know this, but sometime in early August 2016, Maren's 80s Mercedes was in New Music Friday. And that was not the first single that they brought to radio and country radio. And I know that it was early on in New Music Friday days, but there was a lot of interest. It was pretty high up in the list, and I remember hearing it and going, oh, "This is a really neat record." Yeah. And I wasn't I'm not really a country listener. They weren't necessarily looking for me, and I just remember hearing it and just kind of like, that's a really interesting mixture of genres there. So there was something intentional and purposeful about at least her team right from get-go in terms of how they were positioning her in the market.
Yeah. Just so you know, before John joins, so John's at Getty Music now, which is a Christian music label. And then prior to this, he was at Spotify. But before he joined Spotify, you were doing, am I correct in saying you were in radio promo?
Yeah, I was vice president of radio promotion for Curb Records here. Was there for 16 years.
Yeah.
So I've been in Nashville for a while.
He's also an amazing guitar player and musician, just so you know. So Maren, one of the most significant stories on streaming for a long time, but then probably the biggest story in streaming thus far is Lil Nas X and all the stuff that went in and around that. And it's significant not only from the perspective of, I think it's still the #1 record in the country, but it's also significant, at least from my perspective, in how some folks kind of stepped in front of that and said, this is not the kind of music that we want on this particular chart, and sort of said it's coming off of it. And then the public or the audience or the subscribers or whatever you want to call them on streaming platforms kind of went, we don't really care what it is. It's just something we like. And it's #1 on the Billboard 100, Hot 100.
8 weeks, I think.
8 weeks, and still there, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Was that? Yeah, it might be around that, and one cannot underestimate the power of Billy Ray Cyrus when it comes to making a song popular. I'm just being facetious. Yeah, it's very savvy, but I think what's also significant is that in the old days, right, if the gatekeepers kind of went, this ain't gonna fly for whatever reason, that pretty much was the end of the decision matrix. So, but what seems to have happened now is that the public has driven the consumption of the song into the stratosphere, and so it doesn't really matter what the gatekeepers or whomever are making decisions about these things. And it's really interesting that on the other side, based on what I've read, that he decided to sign with Columbia because the CEO or the person who was handling A&R for Columbia happened to have an Instagram account. Like, that was really important to him. So, interesting. At any rate, all this to say, streaming has played a huge role in breaking artists into genres or into spaces that may have not been accessible before. And so now trap country is like a thing, and Blanco Brown now has a record out, which I really love, and I think that's going to make some waves on the format. Anyway, So the goals of this presentation. What I hope to achieve, or what we hope to achieve in this presentation, are the following things. We're going to show you some best practices to implement and to practice so that your presence on some of these platforms is significant, and hopefully at the end of the process, which will take some time, you can leverage some of that stuff and you can become a streaming service within the streaming service. In most of these cases, it's going to probably be Spotify. For some others, it might be Apple Music. If you know how to leverage the tools inside Pandora's AMP playbook, it could possibly be Pandora for you. We won't have much time to go into Pandora, but Pandora's suite of tools is really impressive, and you can do some serious damage there if you so choose. And then SoundCloud to some extent. You can also leverage SoundCloud to a large extent to build your audience, and they all tie into each other. And so the streaming services themselves, alongside your social media prowess and PR, can help you sort of coordinate an effort to drive people to specific platforms and to drive people from platforms for which you might already have traction onto your own fan base. And if you are not thinking about your mailing list as part of your arsenal, then you're missing an opportunity, because mailing lists, in my opinion, are still very much in style. And to a large extent, it's how you can convert a large amount of your fan base when you're trying to communicate an idea or a campaign or a suggestion. So I would urge you, if you've not vested or invested into a mailing list platform, to do so soon. So the whole idea behind this is that you create leverage for yourself on each one of these streaming platforms, or you pick a platform you want or you like, and you decide to leverage that into something you can use. And this can reduce your dependency on playlists so that you're not chasing playlists, you're not begging people to add you to playlists, and then you don't become desperate, and then you start paying to get on playlists that you think are going to move the needle for you, when in the end they might not, and you end up paying for spots on playlists that do nothing for you. Right? I'm going to show you some tools that you should have access to or should be using if you aren't already. Then you should learn how to leverage those tools. Maybe not become an expert, but be able to use it well enough to serve your needs. And then we'll talk about some case studies, and we'll try really hard to get to case studies really quickly, because I think those would be real ways that you can see how some of these things have taken effect. And then at the end, we'll wrap and have a Q&A session. Okay. You guys with me so far? Any questions?
How do you feel about us taking pictures of your slides?
Whose pictures?
Of the slides.
Yeah.
Are you okay with that?
With pictures in my slides?
Yes.
Like onto social?
No, just for our own use.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, please. Steal, take whatever you need, repurpose, say this was all your idea. I don't really care.
Also, we're streaming live on Facebook right now, so if you want to go to @helping music on Facebook or @systemic, we're actually syndicating it. So you can see that later, watch the whole thing again. We'd love it if you share it. Thanks.
Thank you, Logan. Oh, and then if you're on socials, if you can use the hashtag streaming home, hashtag streaming home, that will give me a way to go back and sort of catalog some of the observations. And then when we come back for Q&A, you can also use that hashtag, and if it's on Twitter, I can pick up that question. So, okay, here we go. So one of the things that I think everybody needs to be aware of is that, especially on Spotify, and John, once we get through this section, I want you to speak a little bit to this, but what we found works is that your content, and in most cases, that will probably mean your music, your releases, have to be compelling, and you're going to go, what's compelling? Well, if your audience reacts to it, it's compelling. But beyond compelling, it has to be constant. So you can't put out a single or an album, especially if you're new or emerging or mid-level and you haven't built an audience yet. If you come out with a 12-song album, there's exceptions to everything, and I'm going to talk about one of those exceptions. But if you have a 12-song album because you made a 12-song album and you decide that you're going to drop that entire 12-song album on one Friday, then your runway to sort of leverage the album is going to be really, really short, especially if you don't have an audience yet, right? So if you have a 12-song album, I would think about doing like 2 EPs, and prior to those 2 EPs, having like 3 or 4 singles ahead of the EP dropping, right? Because it gives you longer runways. And again, I'm going to have John speak to this, but having that constant content is going to help the algorithm and possibly the curators pay attention to your music. It has to be consistent, right? Constant and consistent, which means that I don't know, my guess is you want every single or every song to have a consistent quality to them, single to single. But I'd be interested to do an experiment where one song sucks and just see how that reacts, right? And then making sure that the community that is supporting you is well aware of the music coming out and being out there and asking them to support it. Do you have some thoughts about how to sort of leverage content as it's coming out, John?
Well, I like the 4 C's. This is great. Let's take the first one. Actually, let's take community and sort of combine that with constant communication as a 5th C, right?
Yeah.
So, many of you are in relationships, right? And you should look at your music as sort of a relationship that you have with your fans, or make your fans sort of like you're married to them or you're dating. You don't want to release something and then see you later, right?
That's right.
Because there's plenty of things to take their attention away. So I know that this really kind of sounds 101, but the one thing I can tell you about when you're building communities of fans, especially through streaming, is that if they're fans and they're following you, they want to hear from you. So being able to give them constant supply of content is really sort of key. And being able to back up accordingly. And what I mean by that is being able to write out a plan, simply sort of figure out a way to take a look at a calendar and back up enough time so you're constantly understanding the flow of material that's coming from you through streaming into your community. It's always going to be compelling. I'm sure everybody that makes music and making music believes that it is compelling. What you find out very quickly through data or the reaction to it is that some things stick, some things don't. And you can adjust accordingly as an artist, or you can continue to go and do what it is that you do. Right. But there's a lot of learnings because you're constantly in a feedback mode with streaming. It is what I love about streaming and what I love about developing communities of audiences online through streaming is that you're constantly in research and development. And you are creating some source of income from that research and development. So we've talked a lot about this. The idea is that it's necessary to fail and to provide as many opportunities for you to fail as often as you can. And why is that important? It's important because you learn something from failure.
Yep.
Or you stop. Most artists that believe in themselves, they don't stop. They're convicted beyond anything that's rational. And I like irrational artists.
Right.
I like the fact that they're like, no, I'm just going to continue to do it. They are making art. And it's not everybody's going to get it. But they have to consistently release often enough to be able to build trust. So when you're communicating, be it through communicating in your relationship or communicating in the relationship that you have with your audience through music, you are building trust with a fan base. and you have to do it consistently.
Yeah.
So what does that look like in best practices, right? That varies for every artist.
Right. Right.
I've always recommended, and it's a moving target, and it's all based on what your experience is for the first release and then what follows it. So when I was at Spotify, if I had an opportunity to talk to an artist or a manager, it was usually, it's 4 weeks, buddy. If you're a new artist, it's possibly even less than that. The newer that you are, the more often that you have to communicate. When you have established an artist, there's at least enough people in the wheelhouse that know you and the churn that you've created by releasing, that you've built enough trust to be able to take your time a little bit. But in order to build an audience and to get attention, you have to release as often as possible.
Yeah, we were at this mastermind, master think tank thing yesterday, and Rick Barker was talking about socials. And I think what he said at some point yesterday evening really resonated with me, and I think it's across the board no matter what. So for example, I'm trying to think of an example in terms of, let's just say, you're on a YouTube channel, and you're on this YouTube channel because you like cooking, and you want to hear from a specific chef or a specific cook about cooking, and that's your sort of point of focus. So maybe you tune in every week, every other week, but as far as the chef or the show on YouTube is concerned, or for that matter, if it's even on your television, you tune in every week. Like, my wife, picks on me because I love diners, drive-ins, and dives. I just think Guy Fieri is crazy in the best sort of way, she didn't understand how I could love Guy Fieri and Anthony Bourdain. Like, I loved both those guys, and those guys hated each other, right? So, but the key to me was that if one day, I love Guy. I think he's amazing, and I loved Anthony Bourdain, and I still watch those shows and reruns. But if Guy, goes 6 months and doesn't put out a new show or doesn't put out a new episode, I'm going to go find somebody else, right? And I'm going to go watch some other show or some other thing because there's no engagement. So if you decide that, okay, I'm going to put out a single or an album today and then wait 6 months, you might have a very loyal audience. But there's so much noise and so much content out there that there's a chance people might move on from you. There might be some attrition in terms of the fan base. And so if you don't put out content and if you don't put out music, or if in between you putting out music, you don't have some other kind of content, like videos or short-form engagement strategies, then, you're, again, doing yourself a disservice, and whatever momentum you've built is going to be affected because you haven't given you a chance to engage with the audience on a regular basis.
Yeah, and those are really, really, really great points, Charles. I think the one thing that kind of changes that, and I'm looking for that artist that all of a sudden yings to that yang, right?
Yeah.
That all of a sudden just says, you know what, I'm not going to put anything on streaming services. I'm going to create my own scarcity, right? Somebody's doing it right now, and they're probably winning in some way, and it's going to challenge all of this.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a constant, but until you've built the trust of fans, to me that's the most important thing. I don't know if there's a quick answer for being able to create trust, other than consistent, great material that builds enough churn and enough people hearing about it for a certain amount of time where you can stop for a second and assess what that looks like. And it's going to be different for every artist, and that's the one thing I can tell you, that a lot of these things, there are best practices, but those practices are not best for every artist.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. One size doesn't fit all, I don't think. So, and that's going to be part of your process in terms of figuring out what to do, in terms of creating leverage, is what's the best process for what you do as an artist or your team. So David Macias once told me this, and I believe it to my core, in that you have to have a narrative or a story about your artists, and if you don't, and hopefully it's a compelling story, but there needs to be a story around the focus of the music. And if you don't have that, then that kind of has to be step one. And in terms of Spotify, you need to know, or Spotify or Amazon or Apple, you need to know what the core demographic of that particular fan base on that particular on that particular platform looks like. So just remember that. So in terms of Spotify, it seems to be mostly millennials. John, is that sort of your...
There's a pretty significant growth of people 35 plus as as these services, the streaming services are becoming more like bottled water, right? Now, you know, that was like, yeah, it was a big deal to like go into a store and see bottled water. Wow. That's a long time ago, but still it was like, really? You're going to pay for something that you can get out of the faucet for free? Right? So, I mean, now it's everywhere. You can't get away from it. Very few people drink tap water, right?
Yeah.
You don't even think about it. I mean, if you love Fiji water, I mean, I guess you're going to look for it.
Yeah.
But generally, hand me a bottle of water. There's no brand on it. So, like, streaming services haven't necessarily become that yet.
Yeah.
But you know what? Some of this kind of speaks to this idea that I kind of get challenged a lot with, the idea of discernment. There's so much coming at you, and you have to figure out what it is that you want to assign value to for your time and resource.
Yeah.
Right. So, how the streaming services are sort of going into this next level of engagement from older consumers is really about making it so easy for them, for people that really don't have time, for it to be like water. They're not native to it like the millennials might be. So, and Spotify's doing a really good job, I think, of sort of engaging an older audience. Certainly doubling down on podcasts, but that's all around everywhere. Because older people are interested in thinking more than they are maybe dancing.
Right. The sort of the Pandora-izing of streaming platforms to some extent.
Yeah, and as you could see, and I know, I imagine as you guys are users of different services that you might like, I'm kind of curious if, from a show of hands, who uses Spotify here only as the only service? Okay, Apple Music. Okay, wow. None of them other than YouTube. Anybody? Okay. Deezer. Anybody use Deezer? Wow. And Pandora. Okay. Wow. Okay. So it's hard to assess the age group here, but 2 years ago, from an age group standpoint, if you were a little bit older, I would have wondered if you were a Pandora user
For
first,
sure.
right? So,
yeah.
But that's pretty accurate, 82 to 2004. The only way that Spotify will be a successful company for the long run is to get into the money demos,
Yeah.
right? So, but they're doing that. The issue is that they're not making guys like me more anymore. They're making more people that are younger, right? So they have them already. And there was sort of, this might be just sort of inside information or interesting to you, not really inside, at Pandora to effectively target an audience that probably may know who you are and maybe a little bit more passive in terms of their usage, and that may be where you spend a lot more of your time and focus. The point, they all exist, so you have to be on all of them.
Yep.
But once you've gotten that done, you know, okay, this is the folder I'm working with, and these are the individual papers that I want to pay attention to.
Yeah.
So.
No, someone came to us last week, and they wanted to bring us on to help with streaming on Spotify and Apple Music and all that stuff. And they sent me the link to the music, and it was very sort of retro, 60s, surf. I mean, it almost sounded Beatlesque without being Beatlesque. And they asked me as to how how we should go about strategizing, marketing this on Spotify or Apple Music. And my first thing was, forget about all that. Get on Pandora and start tagging your stuff, because your audience is probably, for the majority, going to be on Pandora. It's going to be more lean back and not want to be engaged. And so hopefully at some point after engaging on Pandora, you can then end up being on like a surf radio channel on Pandora or something. And I kind of feel like Spotify is seeing some of that value with the launch of Stations, you know? So, yeah.
Yeah, the Stations app was live in Australia for a little while. Very easy interface. I'm always curious about the products that we had at Spotify in terms of how much data they ate up, especially in underdeveloped countries, where there were telecoms, they were very difficult. Or issues, or there were limits on
caps.
Yeah. It was a friend of mine who just came back from South Africa, actually Swaziland, which I guess is right near it, and he was talking to me about how he couldn't communicate out of there after a certain time because they were capped his, access. And I'm like, wow, we're talking about the growth of streaming in emerging markets is still really in its infancy.
Yeah.
To begin with. And this is what I mean, like when we talk about, those are broader issues. I don't know if they relate to you as an artist, but I'm always curious as to how well the artists know their own background and where their music is influenced from, and how they can really think about the global platform of Spotify and less of where they reside now.
Yep. Well, so I'm from the Far East. I grew up in Malaysia, and every time I go back, it's really interesting to me, or it's really fascinating to me how much people are on their mobile phones. But not all of them are smartphones. But there's this weird conundrum. I think in terms of penetration, in terms of adoption, I don't know if there's a better example than the Far East in terms of adoption of the device, right? Mobile devices. But then the conundrum is that data is capped for most people. And so what ends up happening is, and then the way that telcos work there is way different than here. Here you kind of like commit to one telco, and then you sort of do the dance every month in terms of what you pay and what you don't pay. But then over there, you just buy these cards, you stick them, and then when you run through data, you just go out and buy another card. Right? So, yeah, data is capped, but data is also extremely cheap. Yeah. So it's just really interesting. So if you're a mass consumer of data on those devices in those countries, then that's sort of a weird conundrum, because it's relatively cheap, but then at the same time psychologically, do I really want to play this song because it's going to eat up my data? Do I really want to watch this video? It's going to eat up my data. No one's really
thinking about that.
Yeah.
Until they hit their cap.
Yeah. Right.
So the Stations app actually sort of like, I think, is a little less taxing on your data as well. But the Stations app was, if I understand correctly, was really kind of an attempt to really key into an older demo that is not necessarily going to sit there and make their own playlist or be intentional. It's about the passive massive, or the massive passive, right? And
they're paid massive passive.
Paid massive passive.
That's what I think.
And that's kind of that's why you see, from a Wall Street perspective, or why you see investors go, I'm going to buy that stock.
Yeah.
Because they recognize that we're still this is influencers. All of you in this audience and people that might be streaming, man, you're on the way far
You're tastemakers.
Yeah, you really are. I mean, in terms of what this really is.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. That got a little off into the rails there, but I just want you to kind of understand what's going on. So Spotify audiences lean in, definitely engaged. Yeah. So if you're an artist, this is probably one of the money sections of the talk. We're going to talk about tools. So, again, show of hands. Who here uses Spotify for artists on a regular basis? Okay. Who here uses Apple Music Connect? Good job. Anybody aware of a platform called Chartmetric? Okay. I'll show you what all those things are in a second. Same thing with Next Big Sound. Okay. So Next Big Sound, if you guys don't know, has been around the longest. And it really has great utility. But I just think they've done a really poor job of marketing what it is that they do. And then, like I was saying earlier, the Pandora Amp playbook thing is pretty dang impressive. So what I'm going to do now is switch out of the slide. And I'm going to do the thing you're not supposed to do when you're doing presentations, which is do a live internet session. And Logan just started freezing in the corner. All right, so I'm going to show you something called Spotify for Artists. And Spotify for Artists is cool for this particular reason. Watch me expose my clients. Ah, it's just my just my artist. That's fun. Is it raining out there?
What was the show of hands on people that utilize Spotify for Artists again? Okay, so you guys are somewhat familiar with how to utilize it. I never used it when I was at Spotify.
Because you weren't the artist, you were the curator. All right, so this is for my, I don't know if you can see very clearly. This is the good thing and bad thing about high resolution. But I manage a young artist named Jilian Linklater, who, for my money, is one of the best songwriter artists in this town, which is why I'm working with her. But she just put out a single. Well, she's put out a whole bunch of singles this year and end of last year. She has a song called Break Up With Your Best Friend that was picked up by NPR and by Tiny Desk. Well, NPR Music, Bob Boylan loved that song, gave it a lot of love. And probably in the last 6 months or so, that is probably the song that has gotten the most traction. But in the last week or so let me just show you what I meant by that. Man, I'm so sorry this is hard to see. But in the last 28 days, which is sort of the minimum, it's not the minimum window, but it's sort of the window that matters in terms of looking at data in terms of a specific window and in terms of you putting out music. But she has a song that's been on sync for Disney called Time to Go. And in the last week, in the last 7 days, that song has generated about 1,400 streams. And most of those streams have been around in the last 3 days or so. So part of my mission this past few weeks has been, past few days, has been to figure out where those streams are coming from. And it wasn't added to a new playlist or anything like that. It's on a really significant independent user-generated playlist called Indie Mono's Cover Songs. But what I want to sort of have you take away from this is that what's really driving adoption and discovery for this particular song in the last 7 days is Discover Weekly. So we hit some thresholds on that song a few weeks, couple of months ago, where enough people, like we did call to actions to her fan base to add that song to their own playlists. So we could get the saves to follow ratio. Again, I apologize for this just not showing up so great. Okay, there you go. Ah, the zoom function. So Discover Weekly is a playlist, and it isn't a playlist. It is an algorithmic playlist. And the beautiful thing about ending up on Discover Weekly is that it serves the music to people who might not know the artist just yet. And it's very targeted. It's very personalized. And there's a whole bunch of personalized playlists in Spotify now. But Discover Weekly and Release Radar were the ones that were sort of the initial personalized playlists. So the nice thing about Discover Weekly is that you can, those playlists can drive not only stream count, but they can drive engagement to a very high level. And so I love, like part of our strategic plan in terms of working on streaming marketing and strategy is trying to trigger the algorithm to add the songs to Discover Weekly playlists for individual users. And at least in terms of Time to Go, in the last 28 days, if you look at those songs, Time to Go has generated about 4,000 streams, which is way higher than any other song in a catalog, because what ended up happening over the course of the lifetime of that song, this is the last 28 days. So these parameters or these metrics right here, it has to, in the last 28 days, it's generated 8,000 plus streams, these many listeners and these many saves. But over the course of the song being out, if you look at time to go, it's generated more than 5,000 saves, more than 35,000 listens. And with respect to the streams, that's a very favorable ratio. So we found that if you can get to about 15-20% of saves versus listenership or follows, that triggers Discover Weekly picking up that song and serving it out to people who haven't heard the artist yet. So I don't know what you've observed from inside, whether that's sort of those save ratios matter, and whether once you crack 1,000 streams, things start to happen when you start to enable saves and follows, correct?
A lot of what you're talking about right here, just like looking at it, I can tell you, like, if you do it sooner, it's helpful.
Yeah.
Especially right after release, like if you're able to do that.
Yeah.
So longer, it's harder because more music is in the churn.
Yeah.
This is kind of, I wouldn't say is completely based on what the algorithmic personalized playlists are.
Yeah.
But the idea is that Spotify wants to find more ways to engage with catalog, and catalog can be music that was released, 2 months ago to 25 years ago. Right?
Yeah.
So a lot of this has to do with it. Those listeners to streams ratio is also a factor in terms of being able to build exposure through Discover Weekly.
Yeah. So
the other factor is really release radar.
Yeah.
Which is, and if you're not doing it, you need. I'm curious. It's the easiest tool for you guys to manipulate outside the platform to drive in your socials to people to follow your profile page.
Yeah.
So we can talk more about how that's effective.
Right. So that's about the best practices thing. So follows are the most important thing as far as we've learned in terms of activating the algorithm, right? So following the profile, saving the song to your own, or having your fans save the song to their own playlist helps the algorithm identify which songs are being active. Stream count is cool from the perspective of getting paid.
Sure.
But stream count itself, without follows or saves, it's not the long tail. It just gives you a sort of a shorter gratification thing, and it gives you your 0.004 cents or 0.006 cents or whatever it is. But in terms of a long-term strategy, you want to have your fan base save the song, follow your profile. So she put out a song a couple of weeks ago called Still Making Memories, part of a global ad campaign, and that song hit, it's going to be at almost 2,000 streams here in less than 2 weeks, and we're hitting a pretty good ratio. And so what I predict, or what I suspect will be happening, it hasn't hit Discover Weekly yet, but Still Making Memories is making an impact on release radar, right, by relative listens. So some of that stuff. So this particular song hasn't been added to an official playlist or something like that, but we're good because we can activate the base of her fans to go listen to the song, to go save the song, to go follow the song, and eventually it's going to hit one of the algorithmic playlists. We believe, at least historically, that's been true. So this is Spotify for Artists. Spotify for Artists is also the spot you would go looking to find out how the songs are performing, how, what your listenership looks like, and whether the song has been added to a playlist and stuff like that. But the other cool thing, and she's got new music coming, but it isn't in the system yet. Let me see if I can get it. There we go. gonna go to the presentation. Is that it? Yeah. So if I go to the presentation, we have a slide. All right. So when you have a piece of music coming out, you go to Spotify for Artists and you submit it into the system to be considered for curation or for editorial playlists, right? And this is what that interface looks like, because then you can submit, it'll tell you have this upcoming release, and then it'll prompt you to submit, and then you can tag the song the way you think it should be tagged, and there's probably some optimal strategies for that. What are your thoughts around submission and how to tag songs?
First of all, it's my favorite thing that I ever had to experience in life was actually getting to know this submission process.
Yeah?
Because it's streamlined the way that the editorial staff listen to music.
What, you didn't like getting stuff through Google Sheets?
No. But I will tell you that up until last year, nearly everybody in the editorial team, and as well as on Spotify, actually utilized Google Sheets and got links from various sources and stuff like that. It's a mess. It was already difficult to handle the amount of music coming in that was submitted. But in addition, to sort through your email with links that were not of all, you had a Box account, Dropbox, SoundCloud. I mean, it's just a mess. So some genius in the building, and they really are. That team is to be applauded. Made it really incredible to sort of set up a DMZ room. So think of North and South Korea, and think of a room that's there, and the table is split between North and South. And there are people on one side and the other, and you pass papers along. But imagine that room and that table not being able to see or interact with or speak to the person that's on the other side. But you're still able to get that information across. What you submit here is exactly what I used to see. So it's the way to pitch and the way to communicate with the editorial team on what intentionally it is that you want to do. Music cultures is a fascinating category, one that created a lot of arguments in terms of certainly the genre that I oversaw, Christian music. I fought valiantly, and I hope that I did a good job in terms of being able to get Christian as a culture as an option, as opposed to a genre, and that was really, really helpful. You can change these prior to release. So if you have a box that you're have a space to be able to talk about your release, there are different ways that you can maximize out that spot. Not being very stat heavy, being very thoughtful about what it is that you want to get an editor to think about when they're hearing your music. But there's a lot of communication that happens within a very elegant way to submit music.
So when you say, in terms of music culture, mm-hmm. and being thoughtful about it and submitting, and you can change it prior to submission, what is sort of the last window of time prior to submission that you can change things around?
I don't remember exactly when they lock it out, but I do know that once it's up, you can't change it.
Yeah, right. So you can change it right up to like 24 hours. But in terms of a curator, I'm not sure if that's useful, right? So
I'm thinking of ways that you can utilize the pitch tool to reach a broader base of editors based on the genre that you pick.
Got it.
Right.
All right.
So I was speaking with the manager of an artist about the different singles that they were putting up week after week or every 3 weeks, and they were on a good clip of being able to release things. And I had heard the music ahead of time that they were considering and the schedule of what they were considering to put up. And the music between songs were really, really different. But the artist had some notoriety as a pop or an indie pop artist. It was a really different record for her. And I encourage them to really kind of think through, well, what would be the subgenres of those songs, and to actually, the next release that they put up actually change the genre. One could be indie first, the second could be pop, the next one could be folk, to be able to communicate to the broader grouping of editors and teams that exist in Spotify, in order to be thoughtful about the music and where you want it to be positioned. I think that is one of the great things about the tool, and maybe people just don't really think about. So, and it can go on and on and on. It's a very valuable tool.
I want to quickly go through Chartmetric. So what was that? Yeah.
Sorry, before we move on from the Spotify forum, I just wanted to get your opinion on what is the best practice for that last description box. What is the best use of that space from the Spotify perspective, from the person that's reading that?
My background was in record promotion and marketing, so most of the time I was laughing at how bad the submissions were. But I had a different experience set coming in. So I was looking at this like, man, they're totally focused on radio. Here's all the radio stats. I don't care a flying flip about what you're doing at radio. Like, tell me about the song. So I always defaulted back to, well, just don't talk to me like I'm deciding whether or not you succeed or not. Talk to me like I'm a fan, or a potential fan. So tell me about what the song is about, where you think, what sort of encouraged you to write this song or create this music, and less on the industry, because that could vary from person to person. What your meaning behind the song is driven by you. So that's going to resonate to anybody that resonates with it. So that's my one thing, is to kind of get away from the stats. Yeah.
Before we get to case studies, because I really want to get to case studies, I want to show you this tool called Chartmetric. The website is chart, C-H-A-R-T, metric, M-E-T-R-I-C, .io. A single user account is free. I strongly encourage you to sign up for it, because it gives you a data perspective or a portal into how your music is performing on Spotify and elsewhere across other streaming platforms. But it also gives you a very different holistic perspective on what's going on with your artist or your music. So for example, I work with a young woman named Amanda Cooksey, and she's great. And we don't have any new music out currently, but we're working on it. But what you want to kind of take a look at in terms of beyond just the music stuff is that she's got some songs out here. Let's see. There should have been a social graph thing. That's so weird. It didn't pick up on that. Let me go elsewhere and take a look at somebody else. So if I go look at Jilian's stuff. Alright, so all the sort of ratios in terms of where she is, in terms of followers and all that data is there certainly. But if I go down here a little further, I know what her audience breakdown is, at least by Spotify data. And those all make sense in terms of where she is. And then it tells me what her Instagram engagement rate is, tells me what her socials look like. And that's just the platform pulling that information. We don't submit that. So that's really, really useful. And it tells me where she's being picked up outside of Spotify telling me where she's picked up. And so Spotify playlists certainly, but also across the ecosystem. She's on Apple Music. It'll pick up Deezer stuff. She's on Deezer. It'll tell me all the charts she's on in the streaming platforms. And then they just added Amazon, but she's not on any of the Amazon charts. So we don't have, oh, here we are, Amazon playlists. So if you end up on an Amazon playlist, it'll give you that information as well. But the other thing I want to show you on Chartmetric is that all the stuff, if you decide to go out and let's just say, not that you would ever do this, but you want to go invest in some playlists and pay them off and stuff to add your music, you can actually go ahead and do your own research as to whether something is worth your while or not. So for example, like these are the official Spotify playlists for the most part. So I want to look at exclude Spotify or major label brands. And these are all individual, independent user-generated playlists, and it'll give you an idea, so like what the 28-day follower change is, average monthly listeners, and if you are being pitched, or if you're being told, or someone tells you, oh, if you give me $50, I'll put you on this playlist, then you want to go up and make sure that playlist that you're investing in actually has followers, or not more than just the follower count, but it has actual listeners. So Zodic, for example, has almost 500,000 followers, but then the actual number of listeners is about 1,100, which is a pathetic conversion rate, right? And then all these 500,000 follower playlists don't necessarily generate a whole bunch of listenership. So you want to be really careful about how you go about strategizing your streaming marketing strategy. So chart metrics is important from you knowing how you're performing on different platforms, but it's also important in that it gives you information how specific playlists are performing on platforms. I'm going to quickly switch into case studies, and I'm going to just pull up some of these artists that we have. So this is specifically for Spotify. I want to tell you about an artist named Ron Pope, who organically let's see, Ron Burgundy, that would be a good one. So this is Ron Pope. I'm going to see if I can resize.
Ron Burgundy plays the flute, right? Is that right?
He sure does. Let me see if it'll resize for this. You have any thoughts as to how to resize the screen here? Yeah. Just having a...
He seemed to just lost a monthly listener right there. I don't know if you noticed that, but that number went down one.
It did? Zoom in. Command plus.
You were telling me a story about Ron, that he's sort of like in the middle of the Taylor Swift don't use Spotify thing. He was kind of anti that. He was like,
yeah, I don't know if he was, so there was this editorial. So this is how I got into this whole mess, by the way. Okay, so that's Ron. I don't spend a whole time zooming in. But Ron puts out music. He's an alternative indie rock, indie pop guy. And he began to experience adoption and engagement on Spotify in the Scandinavian countries just organically. Spotify never added him to any sort of editorial playlist. But his music resonated with that particular population and grew and grew. And now he currently has 1-point-something million monthly listeners, and he has almost 230,000 followers. And so he could put out music and not be dependent on any playlist. He could just put out music, and because of the follower count that he had, and because of the monthly listenership that he had, he could just put out music and be fairly confident that there would be a floor, a minimum floor of where he would, make revenue, have some traction, so on and so forth. But the story that John's talking about is that, the way all this started for us was that in October of 2015, Taylor Swift left Spotify. She took great fanfare, claiming that Spotify wasn't paying artists and blah, blah, blah. And that, there's some truth to that. There's some PR marketing to that. And to great fanfare, she left the platform. And everybody was like, yeah, including myself, was like, yeah, Taylor, show those evil people at Spotify just that they can't push people, those songwriters around. And November, Ron wrote an editorial piece for Billboard that said, basically, that I love Taylor Swift. I have every one of her records. I have all her albums. I think she's amazing. But I don't understand. I don't understand why she isn't being paid, because I own all my stuff, and this year I made $250,000 on Spotify, and my head just spun around. And so, actually, this is October 2014. So that made me sort of investigate the whole thing and figure out that there were such people like curators and editors at Spotify, and then reach out to them and pitch the music from an artist for a client of mine named Keeley Valentino, and we got it on Your Favorite Coffee House. Long story short, the song that made it onto Your Favorite Coffee House had, in the space of about 2 years, generated about 12 million streams, and it's now like close to 15 million. But all this to say, Ron Pope was a huge inspiration in terms of us doing this, because not dependent on playlists, not dependent on what anybody was doing or not doing for him, he was just putting out music that was constant, compelling, and consistent, that appealed to a specific audience on the platform, and that audience was big enough to support him regardless of whether it was playlist support. I'll do one more thing before John jumps on the whole, this amazing case study that he wants to talk about that I think you'll really enjoy. I consult for a company called Symphonic. We have just recently onboarded a young woman named Julia Nunes. And Julia is part of the reason why I have a digital marketing career. We talked a lot about her success on YouTube. She's a huge YouTube star. She has something like 230,000 subscribers on YouTube, and again, thousands and thousands of fans on all her social media platforms, minimal support on Spotify. But she just put out a single on Friday called Sudden Moves, and the album comes out on the actual album comes out this Friday, also called Sudden Moves, and it's a beautiful record. But in the space of about 4 or 5 days, the single has close to 15,000 streams without any editorial support, because she can drive her fan base. So if she says, hey, go listen to this on Spotify, or go listen to this on Apple Music, and save this song, and follow me on the platform, they just go do it. And she has killed it on Kickstarter. She has raised something close to like $500,000 on Kickstarter in different campaigns. And one of those campaigns was one of the first digital marketing campaigns that we were sort of, involved in sort of an ancillary way. And that particular campaign raised close to $75,000, which at that point for a musician on Kickstarter was a huge, huge achievement. So, again, building your own audience on platform, off platform, can make you totally independent and not dependent on editorial support, because you may get it, you may not get it. And you don't want to be in a situation where if you don't get editorial support, or if you don't get playlisting support, then you're sort of left floundering, right? So you want to think about your mailing list, you want to think about Instagram, you want to think about Facebook, you want to think about YouTube, which still, to this day, is the #1 music discovery platform. So think about that, and some of the strategies around how to grow that stuff is a little bit outside the scope of this workshop, but John has this fascinating case study that I think you'll find very interesting. So I'm going to pull that up.
Just quickly, the people that are engaged with Julia love her, because they not only followed her directions by being intentional about go stream me, but also go follow me and click through.
Yeah.
So those are actually 3 different steps. And I've always find it very curious, and I don't know enough about this, is how do you get all the things that you want people to do intentionally in a very cohesive way that doesn't overwhelm them? And how often can you really kind of tell them to do that? But you can, because the people that love you, they want to be engaged with you a lot. They want to hear that you love them. You really do.
She's about as close as to a cult figure online as you can get without being obnoxious. Well, if you have time, I'll come back and investigate some of those parameters. But I just want to make sure that John gets a chance to talk about this fascinating thing.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about something that I worked on early on in my time at Spotify. It's more, there may be some learnings here. I hope that there will be. It isn't anything, earth-shattering, but it was more of how a church, a non-for-profit organization, was able to actually go from 0 profile to 1 million followers or 1 million listeners within a span of 30 days. And they did that not really knowing that they were going to stumble into it, but I just happened to be sort of a passion project and became aware of it about 10 days before they released. So very little time of planning. The Belonging is a church here in Nashville. And if you don't know about it, I suggest you kind of learn about them, because they really have an incredible, talented group of people that are a part of it, and a part of their worship team that give their time to their worship team. So there are folks like Lauren Daigle in the worship team. There are Sarah Reeves, Carrie Job, Cody Carnes, Meredith Andrews. These are artists on their own. They're all signed at all different record labels as well, but they contribute their talents to this worship team. So they were part of the worship team. The church was able to get the licenses and get the courtesies from every single one of those labels to put out a project. And then they were thinking about streaming, and we got to put the record up. So they had a little bit of a challenge here, because they couldn't really utilize the individual likenesses. They had no single rights, so they couldn't take a song that Lauren was on and go to radio with it. They're not able to do that. They had one image of all the artists that I talked about involved, so they had only one marketing image. So what we did here, I felt like this, and I was in a situation where I was trying to grow a genre of music, so this is a little bit more internal of how I was able to sort of actually kind of jumpstart a playlist that I had put together called Worship Now. But the learnings here are about being able to, for you to be actually become a better third-party curator of your own music, and actually for you to kind of take the role of being the streaming service inside the streaming service. So a lot of this stuff is going to seem unfair, because I was working on the platform at the time, and this is not necessarily recommended for an editor to do. But I found that this was too good of an opportunity to get all of these audience together to kind of help me out. So Lauren Daigle contributes the Artistry and Independent Church here. Where are we at on the slide? Let's see where we are. Okay, so we talked about the belonging. We're going to go to that page. For leverages purposes only. While in the midst of figuring how to keep top Christian artists visible to their audiences and potential audiences in between releases during long stretches of time, I saw Lauren's involvement here to be a huge plus for her, as well as the other artists that were involved in the worship team. Working in this way, it also served a multitude of other artist development challenges that I was identifying within data, as well as the Spotify editorial challenges. I needed to help raise context and awareness of artists who were making Christian music in their day jobs, but also involved in worship in the churches that they serve. We were trying to provide an audience to share all of the artists involved, and we helped establish a visibility for some new lists for Spotify and driving audience to them. We were trying to address the lack of visible list promotion support from inside Spotify. There are tons of editors and tons of lists that are getting started. Hyper-personalization was a little while in the future. In other words, the algorithm and the personalized playlists that you see now were really kind of nascent. They weren't necessarily out there doing the job that I was about to do.
Which slide do you need, John?
Well, we use what's on hand.
Okay.
So the lead track of this project, Peace Be Still, featured Lauren Daigle. The other artists involved in the release were also well known, but there were issues that stood in the way of each of these artists receiving the benefit out of their involvement, even if that's not what they were thinking about. And they weren't. There was no one sitting there going, oh, we're just going to blow this thing up because Carrie Job has this many followers and this artist has many followers. No one was threading this together in the organization, Spotify, or even the individual record labels that they were assigned to.
Again, 10 days.
Yeah. So I'll briefly go over some of these points here. The church had no specific goals for the project other than that I was aware of beyond releasing it for the purposes of the church. The church didn't have a label structure, but they did a lot of work in terms of licensing the imaging. There was one photo of the band. There were no single rights to the church. The label partners for each of the artists involved didn't have skin in the game externally, and each artist was either in downtime between releases, were working on other music from their own releases or in the marketplace, or are about to release material. There was a time crunch as the conference was about to begin and the album was delivered about 10 days before release. So the songs were already known in the church community before they were up on Spotify or any other streaming services. And this is a key factor of how there is some sort of, if you're thinking strategically and have a way to engage an audience prior to actually putting something up on streaming services, how you can actually start better. And we can talk about it.
Off-platform.
Off-platform.
Right.
Right. I had some concerns the audience of each artist being aware of this project beyond what the church would do to communicate to their membership. Were they active in driving streams to their socials in the platform? I noticed this thing was kind of a super band. The project became an opportunity to see if the fans of all the artists could collectively drive streams to one project, to each other, to themselves, to a brand new artist profile page. Because remember, The Belonging had never released music. So it was going to come up as a new profile page at release. So my head's spinning. My head's spinning now thinking about it. For the future audience reach, regardless of the involvement of these signed artists or their labels. At the same time, I wanted to see if this involvement could actually drive internal audience traffic at Spotify into a relatively new Spotify list without the help of the algorithm or advertising of our own lists. Okay, let's go back to Oz, pulls back the curtain. Yeah, there we go. Okay, no, one more? Okay, the curtain of Oz. As part of this and to address growing activity for new worship music from the audience on Spotify, we included the entire project, all 17 songs of the project, into the Worship Now list. That's really unheard of. I wouldn't recommend doing it. I did. I wanted to see if each of the individual artists could drive traffic. Each of their individual audiences drive traffic into the list. This was about list building. I obtained an approved photo of all the featured artists involved in The Belonging, and I created a custom cover of the playlist to launch the Friday of the album release. My internal defense for this approach was that even though the album was released as a whole and the church themselves didn't have individual single rights, we weren't held to that limitation. And this is important to think about when you're actually making an album. Each of those albums, if you do release, are singles. And they can have lives of their own. So I don't want to fear people into the idea you can't release albums, but it creates a whole other different strategy on how you approach this. I had the luxury of actually treating each of these artists as having individual singles from this project, because I can put them in as many different lists as I wanted to. 1 in here, 3 in here, wherever I felt like we needed to go. We considered each of the 17 songs as standalone singles performed by those artists that were actually released simultaneously, instead of a supergroup album as well. I was also making a wager that this unpacking of the full project release would have no effect on the ability for the church to sell their CD, and it did not have an effect to my knowledge. People who bought also did so, and people who streamed did so. If they did both, it was more than just music, it was about to support the church. Let's talk about Madhouse Mirrors. One of the things that many people love about Spotify platform, and I think is actually really, really helpful to you guys as artists and you're developing your audience, is how you can just get lost down the rabbit hole of discovery. You go from one page to another page, you click on that artist, you go to their artist sound like and whatnot. An additional strategy to reward this behavior for hardcore fans of each of the artists involved in this supergroup was to find a way to use the artist pick feature to create a circle of discovery. So what that meant is that I now had to organize the 11 artists to all put The Belonging as their artist pick, or the list that I put the whole Belonging album in the artist pick. So I slaved over this. It's actually not something that I was responsible for. I saw this as a huge opportunity to grow the list, and it did. So for that first week, if you searched one of the artists involved in the belonging and you went to their profile page, you were met with an artist pick that took you directly to the Worship Now list with the belonging on the cover. When you went to the playlist where the tracks were and you clicked through that from the artist credited, it took you back to the artist and the artist pick was again visible. If you were aware of the record and you just searched it and put belonging in, it would lead you to the project, the profile page. And if you click through the belonging, you'd go to their newly created profile page with their artist pick also directing you back into the Worship Now list that featured the whole project inside the list. If a song appeared on any of our lists or third-party lists alone and you clicked on, and so on and so on. Collectively, each of the artist's monthly listeners for each of the artists involved was a little over 4 million. We coordinated the artist pick in a way that had not been done before. This was simply a coordination between myself, each of them, or their management team to artist pick the Worship Now playlist with the full album in the list, along with the belonging picture of them on the cover. It was a worthy operation to see what happened. Let's go to Peace Be Still. We'll back it up one. Peace Won't Be Still, right? Peace Be Still by Lauren Daigle.
Just one note here.
Yeah.
So I just want to say that sounds a lot like gig sharing, right? So
Yes. So I'll bake out the certain points from this
Okay.
as soon as I run through it. Peace Be Still by Lauren was the #1 song on the Worship Now list, but was also #1 on the album release. Lauren Daigle had also had a good amount of momentum from radio airplay over the last few years, from her singles, from the debut release, but she had not recorded or released new music for 3 years prior to the release of this project, which was not hers. It was part of the church's. As part of the strategy to create additional churn into her music and the success that prior to this, I was able to make a strong case for Lauren's track, Peace Be Still, to be featured in New Music Friday. It was the first Christian artist that I was able to editorially get into New Music Friday. And it made it the release day that it had to happen here. This provided both known and unknown audience churn for the artists on the Belonging project, as well as from listeners who were not even aware of this genre or the artists involved. Just as before, if you click through Lauren Daigle to her profile page, you were met again by her artist pick featuring her and the band featuring on the cover of Worship Now. So what happened was pretty extraordinary. The following week, it reached #2 both on Spotify's global viral chart as well as the US viral chart. That's unheard of for a worship artist.
yeah, up to that point, I don't think there was anything like that.
No,
right?
I mean, Hillsong has done it now, but again, this was a debut artist. And again, yes, they had the Dax Deck, they had a lot of audience, but this is not a genre that's well known at all in the same way that other genres are. So 0 to 1 million. The results were pretty astounding. Peace Be Still reached #2 on the global viral charts and the US viral chart during the week following release. Worship Now added over 100,000 followers during the month and a significant amount of engagement. Lauren, well, you see what happened with her. She continued to create more awareness of her music without having to release new solo music. Peace Be Still was also the first time that she had appeared on New Music Friday. And this began to build an audience for her that had not been reached prior. But it became essential upon the release of this last album she did last year, Look Up, Hot Child. The Belonging reached 1 million listeners in 30 days and continued to retain their audience base without much loss over many months without releasing new music. It was because of the churn that had been created at the beginning, until a single came in April of 2018. Currently, The Belonging is over 500,000 monthly listeners and is preparing its second release coming in September alongside their conference this year. So some of the things I wanted to really quickly talk about. If you have friends that are artists, get with them and coordinate your artist pick. These are really, really small things that you can do to create more sort of curious interaction with your music if you share audiences. And you can find them specifically by just seeing fans also like. There's no reason why you can't find out who is handling their Spotify for Artists account and actually go to them and say, hey, I'd like to share audiences with you to kind of figure out a way to work with you. So these are all very, very coordinated ways, but you have to think about it. This took me, I spent that whole week prior to this release basically essentially becoming the marketing team for the Belonging Church. That wasn't my job. My job was editorial for Spotify. I just saw this such a unique opportunity to test an artist development technique within the confines of the service. So in a sense, for that 1 week, I became the streaming service was inside the streaming service.
Yeah. So again, the streaming service, and again, to John's point, you know, I know this looks huge, and like John was saying, he took a personal interest in the project, right? But that doesn't mean you can't coordinate and create similar momentum on a different scale that can maybe lead to something like that. So, I mean, I've been in this town for a while, and one of the things that I remember about artists and visibility on platforms was this project called 10 out of 10. And 10 out of 10 became a thing because the management teams and the artists themselves created this collective that created this visibility across the whole country. And some of those artists went on to have huge careers. Some of them went on to have mid-level careers. And some of them didn't take advantage of that visibility, right? But think about 10 out of 10 on streaming platforms or on Spotify and how you can coordinate that. And those tools are out there from within Spotify for artists or from within just putting out compilations. There's like a whole bunch of things you can do, but the central sort of thought here is you can empower yourself to gain traction on the platform.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just briefly, I know that the thing is up here, but I can't let it sit there. You see, the monthly listeners are still pretty high. I mean, they were up to 1 million and even higher at certain points during the first, early days of the project. And after that first sort of technique in terms of taking Lauren Daigle's audience and Carrie Job's audience and Cody Carnes' audience and sort of leading to the same thing, it definitely diminished after that. They weren't putting out new music associated with the Belonging. So the engagement now, as you could see, the followers are low because they didn't do any sort of continual sort of follow-up to press follow or commit through that communication. Not to their discredit, they just weren't set up where I wasn't thinking about it, and I didn't work for them. I worked for Spotify. So, but somebody could have looked at this and looked at the data and said, hey, you really got to engage your church. But they're still not, here's the point, they're not starting from zero. So they have an incredible jump-off point now where they're not starting from zero. So in Release Radar, which is a very powerful tool, there at least, we'll have 638 people immediately get the new music deposited into their release radars. I believe that by simple communication with their fan base or the fan bases of those artists that are currently going to be a part of this new project that comes out in September, that they can actually probably get to pretty close to 500,000 followers prior to release. That would be amazing for them to wake up the next day is that everybody that's touched this music or listened to them that month right now, all of a sudden has it in their release radar. People will click through.
Yeah, and that's a way to use artist pick to sort of drive that behavior, right? Even before the music comes out, in terms of whether you create a playlist or whatever. So, like for Julia, for example, we're going to do this thing and say, artist pick, this is the single that's out, add the new album, whether you've experienced the pre-save campaign or not, because one of the things we found when we run pre-saves in Spotify is sometimes people are incredibly resistant to doing a pre-save and clicking save. So on the day of drop, you can still have the artist pick there, kind of go talk about the single or whatever, but yeah, it's limited space. But then you can still say, save the song when it comes out, Anyway, I think that's a good spot for us to kind of wrap. I think we should open up for questions if you're going. So, questions. Yeah.
Okay, I'm here as a open budget manager of would-be artists, and I would love to know what sort of a percentage time-wise you would say that this sort of thing, especially people who are trying to get themselves established with it. I get a lot of pushback from overexcited would-be artists who say, I want to get into
So the idea is that the artist really wants to create and get that out, right? Get that music out.
Very common is what
Yeah,
I find
yeah,
is that, and I do think that a lot of young artists, people are getting to them and taking their money and saying, let's get a
yeah.
CD out there. And I mean, I have, look, you can see I'm middle aged and I'm learning about this stuff, but none of my people are here. It's not clicking. I think there's some tunnel vision going on. What's a good, if I were to go to one of my singers and say, bottom line, you should be devoting X amount of your time to engaging with your fans, and absolutely some of them are performing live anymore.
Sure.
And I keep going, where are you going to get your fan base if you are not out connecting with them?
I've had a lot of artist managers tell me when I ask them, I say, hey, how's it managing? And they're like, well, I did a lot of time managing expectations is what I did.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not really managing an artist. I'm
Yeah.
managing the artist's expectations. And you have to, I think it's really important to slow down and then be fast when you need to be fast.
Yeah.
And I know
Right,
it's,
Hagler?
It's a real paradox. But working with artists, that's what makes them really cool, is that they're on go. They want to get their music out. They want to do it. But it's, you have to understand that and be able to find the right language for them to be able to kind of like let them see this. What's the thing that speaks to them? What's important to them? And then find the contrary opinion to that, to the releasing so quickly in a language that they would understand,
I think the answer is that it varies for every artist. But I think as a species, if artists aren't creating and putting out music, they die. I mean, that is literally the feeling I get from working with the artists I work with. If I don't put this music out, I'm going to die. So and part of my role in management is to kind of, first of all, assure them that they're not going to die. And second of all, say that the audience will be there because you've done all the work up to this point. And if you haven't done the work up to this point, then we have to do the work now before you put the CD out. And all that work is going to be invisible to the rest of the world, but it's work that you need to do to create a platform for that CD. And this is a pet peeve of mine now, why people go into a studio and spend $12,000 on a CD or 15 or whatever it is to put out to an audience that doesn't exist just completely blows my mind. So I think part of the best advice you can give somebody is to say, go and record 3 songs for a lower cost, because that's sort of the break-even point in terms of making your studio time efficient. So go record 3 songs and use those 3 songs as singles over a certain time period. Next question. Yeah.
I'm poor.
Aren't we all?
Right. So, I guess my question is about how important is it possible to drive traffic to yourself as an artist without setting aside a large budget, or is the budget super important? It's just more about allocating it correctly and efficiently.
I think the most important piece is your strategy. And I think cost is going to be dependent. It's always, in my mind, time versus cost, right? So if you have time to learn how to do some of these things, then you should spend the time to become a moderately competent at it. And then I think you can save cost. But at some point, you will have to spend money. But I don't know if it needs to be, I don't know what your pain point is. But, if you're going to run ads on socials, for example, and if you're going to want real engagement, you're going to need to spend during a campaign cycle, a couple of $100 a month on advertising. That, if you're trying to grow your socials, like on Facebook or Instagram or something. But in terms of driving people onto the platform, if you already have a significant audience somewhere, then you can do a mailing list, right? Mailing lists are fairly inexpensive, if not downright free. You can just say, yo, got new music coming out in 3 weeks, go follow my Spotify profile. Your rail costs are probably $9.99 a month or whatever it is. But in actual fact, you putting together a newsletter and sending that out is just free, right? I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking like getting an audience on like Spotify. I feel like it almost seems like you're kind of saying don't be dependent on playlists.
Yes.
But
Not initially, yeah.
I feel like that's like getting on playlists is how people even hear about you at all.
So you want to use the playlist as a marketing plan, right?
Kind of.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
do we hear last month? Playlist is not a marketing plan. Right?
That's so.
Right, so
Getting on a playlist alone is not going to change your audience stuff. What are you doing outside of that to build your audience?
I see. So it's all about not the platforms. It's about like not the actual music listening part. It's about your Instagram and your Facebook and your shows.
Your mailing list. I mean, yeah.
your connection with people.
Are you playing out?
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So to me, those things are. So it doesn't mean that everybody needs to play out. Let's just get that out of the way, right? But you should have a method or a channel or whatever to build an audience. So whether that's even just SoundCloud, like even if you put it up on SoundCloud and people start listening, because it costs nothing to distribute on SoundCloud, right? Do you use SoundCloud at all?
I just kind of throw my demos up there.
Yeah, yeah. So brilliant. So now you have demos. How are you getting people to listen to those demos? Okay. Let's talk later. That's like strategies you can use. Okay. Yes, back.
So, speaking of communicating with your fan base or potential fan base and utilizing streaming platforms, what are your thoughts on like other models such as Bandcamp or even like YouTube Music that's been out for a minute or Amazon Music? Like, how do those compare to things like that's being placed like Spotify, Apple Music, what have you?
I have some real thoughts about that, but do you want to address it?
Yeah, I just get into these 50,000-foot discussions where I can't get past the fact that Spotify's it, and that's probably because I worked there, but I was just a voracious user of it prior to that. I stopped using iTunes like in 2012. I just done. But I just because the service, right? Spotify is the closest thing to a music social media engine that exists because it only exists for music. It's not a portion of another. It's complicated. I got a free account from Amazon, and it took me like 30 minutes to kind of figure out how to redeem it. Like that's just like I'm 50. I'm way out of the demo, right? So I can imagine another person that's vaguely familiar or wants to kind of stream music, and they get this Amazon account and they're trying to link up their Prime to it. It's a nightmare. People don't have time. Like Spotify, while maybe initially kind of complicated, it seems very user friendly, like in comparison to all the other ones, in terms of, and you can build a community with it. It just feels a little bit more easier to use, right? So.
Yeah, I kind of think it depends on your skill set and where your strengths are, But strategically, as a marketing person who's helped artists for a while now, like the lowest barrier to entry, both for you as an artist and both to the consumer, the lowest barrier to entry in my mind, the two platforms that are crushing it right now is Instagram and YouTube. And I don't think it's an accident that those are visual platforms. So video especially, and when you run ads on all those different platforms, whether it's IG or Facebook or Twitter, go on, video is the most tractable consumer form that people react with. And I think it has, my first degree is in a biological sciences related degree. I think from the perspective of a biological species, we see movement either as a threat or as something we can chase after. So video, when it comes up on your screen and your eyes just catch that, you are either going to have an affinity experience or you're going to have a sort of an aversion experience. So video, there's a reason why short form videos work. Once you have engagement in short form video, then you can get them into a more consumable, larger form video. And it's so funny to think about 4-minute videos in larger form, but it is. So the easiest way, in my opinion, if you're halfway competent to build an audience, is to be on YouTube and Instagram right now.
Charles answered that question a lot better than I did. So.
Well, I was like looking for that like validation.
But it can't be a terminal experience, right? So once they watch that Instagram thing or that YouTube thing, you have to give them a mechanism to convert into long-term fans. If they choose not to do it, that's on them. But you can't, like this, if I hear one more person tell me mailing lists are so out and no one uses them anymore, I'm going to punch them, because it's simply not true. Just because you haven't tried it and you haven't done it doesn't mean it's not the major way people communicate with you online. It is.
Over in the back, yeah.
Yes.
So many people trying to sell artists like different things, like you said, playlists, things like that. What would be your top 3 places to put your money?
So I say this as the guy who on a daily basis is accused of being the most brilliant mind on the globe and the biggest thief on the planet. So no matter what happens, you're gonna. I've never had anybody come to me and say, this is completely 100% worth. That's not true. I've had that. But I would say your number one investment is, are you a good performer? I would invest in a good video camera and a good audio capture system. And it doesn't have to be expensive, right? So what, between $500 and $1,000, you can have a system, whether it's video, capture, camera, or something, and an audio thing, and learn how to use it. And people think video is the most important thing. It's not. It's lighting and audio. So if you can create an environment and a process and a protocol to create audio and video of you performing, and it's just undeniable, then I think that's the best use of your money for phase 1. Once you have an audience and you find yourself not having enough time to do all the things you need to do, like marketing or streaming marketing or having a team, you need a team at that point, then you need to decide if you're going to pay for that service or whether you're going to cut people in for a share of your revenue. And if you're going to propose the second proposition, then you have to show them how they're going to, because 50% of nothing is still going to be nothing, right? So, but then if you've got proof, like, okay, last week I had 1,000 YouTube subscribers. This month I've got 2,000 YouTube subscribers. Now we just need strategy to figure out how to grow that, right? So I would say the most important thing is learn to create music that you can put out that's quality, compelling, and all that stuff. And then you also need to invest in marketing. But I think people oftentimes have that flipped over.
We got time for one. I got time for one more, but yeah.
Speaking to the beating of the dead horse regarding the playlist pitching and
Sure.
things like that, in the Spotify world and especially the editorial world, services like playlist pitch and Omni, like they use, in theory, send it to real people to generate real streams, real saves, again on paper in theory. Do editorial people look at that? Do they look at the other playlist that is being put into the raw numbers of like the metadata that comes out of that? Or do curators at Spotify and people who are actually in charge of the labels and A&R, do they not care about that, they just care about the artist and the song?
I think well, I started in March of 2017, and the world was very different in March 2017. There are 40,000 tracks that are being uploaded into the system every day. I don't know how anybody has time to do anything other than address those 40,000 tracks. So I'm answering your question. I just don't know if anybody's paying attention outside of what it is they have to. And the other point is that we were encouraged to listen to music specifically through our own system. So the discovery came from the music, not from how it was being pitched to us. So it's a very enclosed environment.
I was going to say, piggybacking, when you say we were encouraged, so that each curator and how they consume music were encouraged to discover new music.
I spent a lot of, so while we saw the pitch tool, right, through SFA, Spotify for Artists, and it's elegant. I mean, it made it possible for me to never listen to music outside of the pitch tool, which is what it was built for, because everything could be accessed in one very, very clean way. Obviously, I went out to see shows. The editorial staff in all the different countries have access to music and music people on varying levels, but their main responsibility was to listen to music that was being uploaded through the service. So in terms of their awareness of or how they were consuming or how they were discovering things, they were charged with discovering things that were coming through the platform. So in terms of their awareness of other services, I really don't know. In fact, I was aware of those services prior because I knew Charles, and I knew that our marketing team, this wasn't a function of radio promo, but I saw it as a real sort of thing that would actually help me be able to tell a story back to radio with streaming, and that's as early. I was doing that in 2014. So I was like, where are all these playlists? Like do they generate audience that I can show to a radio program that this actually means something? So I'm an early adapter in terms of that. I would have cared more about those services 3 or 4 years ago, and by the time I went to Spotify, I didn't spend any time, or I don't even know the plethora of companies that exist out there. Didn't have time for it. Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question, Logan?
Sure, one more.
One more. Yeah, right. I see you.
Without getting yourself in trouble, can you speak to the reality of outside influence, specifically major labels over Spotify, and then Spotify's influence over what the listener is hearing? What I'm getting at particularly is Old Town Road is obviously wildly popular. I'm wondering how much that popularity is being created, because I hit the button on Spotify for it not to stream, and it still streams almost every single other song. And I can't skip it. I told Spotify not to play that song, and almost every other song is Old Town Road anyway, and I can't skip it.
I've never heard of that.
I haven't either. There are some stats out there. I'm probably old from a stat standpoint, but somewhere around 30, a little north of 30% of the audience that streams is streaming through playlists, curated playlists. That might include the algorithmic playlists or personalized playlists. So that's still a good, strong percentage of people that are on demand, finding music and discovering music and streaming it through what they want and what they're driving and playlists that they put together, the organization of their own sort of music library. So, yeah, those 30% of people that are really just looking for curated playlists. That's a good percentage of people, as the amount of people in there scales, right? But it still is nowhere near the amount of people that are driving it. So I'd say that the audience has really drove Old Town Road. I think it's less to do with curation.
Yeah. I think on the platform and off the platform, there was so much data off the platform as opposed to, I don't know. I think Old Town Road, I mean, I'm incredibly happy for Old Town Road happening, personally, as a person who favors independent music. But I think it would be kind of folly to use that as the default model, right? It's an outlier at this point. I would like to see more it being reproduced, more cases of that. But I think, I think Old Town Road was viral in all the right kind of ways, depending on whether on your perspective whether you like that song or not, I guess. But yeah, I don't think there was sort of like an inside. I could be wrong, but I don't think there was an inside track, inside conspiracy to help Old Town Road blow up the way it did. If that's your question.
Yeah, the audience drives curation. The audience drives the algorithm. The curators there have a good amount of power. They have awareness of music and what's coming, and they can get to hear things early. There's been an argument that there's a Spotify sound out there.
Spotify Core, yeah.
Yeah, which is, I mean, there have been editors that have been there for 5 years, and they have their sort of sound, and they've reacted to the data accordingly. But that sound's not necessarily being driven specifically by an editorial decision, as opposed to the audience that's really like knee deep in Spotify all the time, that has been there for a while, and they've set the computer learning in a certain way. But as the service sort of explodes in Mexico, Brazil, Southeast Asia, India now, it's going to be much more of a diverse look. As the computer there is really meant to surface and music for discovery, music that you may like, music that it hopes that you like, music that it knows you like, and it's going to get so good that it's going to know you better than you know yourself. I mean, it's kind of scary, but it's like when you fire up your Spotify app, depending on what time of day you do it, it's going to serve you the music that it thinks that you're going to really like for the moment that you serve it up there. It should be a great experience, and it's going to be more diverse. I know that it is, because it's already set in motion.
So on that note, thank you everybody for coming tonight. I'm Charles Alexander and John Butler. Logan, thank you again. I really appreciate it. And come check out Helping Our Music Evolve. Home. Come home.